Hello, this is the Trews with Russell Brand and Dr. Brad Evans. Thanks for watching. We're talking about the event in Manchester, primarily from the perspective of media and political response, which is sensitive because even to do that, I suppose you are extracting what must be inconceivable grief and sadness of the people directly affected, which obviously is the victims and their families, but also anybody in Manchester. And I suppose what we want to talk about, Brad, is this from a political and media perspective, and the way that violence is used politically and the way that violence is used both by its perpetrators from the perspective of terrorists and state-sanctioned violence, and the media reporting of these kind of acts of violence.
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to kind of address is that, it's a deeply saddening, tragic, deeply horrifying event, which requires us to, on the one hand, just kind of step back and say, well, this event is wrong, and whatever type of justification people try to put forward for it, it's simply wrong to engage in such violence and target such innocent people. And I think that has to be the start point for any discussion. Now, once it then, of course, goes from beyond that, these types of events are always immediately drawn into some kind of political universe.
How can it not be? I mean, how can it not be? Because otherwise you're suspended in that moment of agonising, unending grief of an act of inconceivable violence and cruelty that no one can ever justify or seek to justify. But all responses to it are political, whether that response is armed police on the street, whether that is calls for borders to be controlled or more access to people's online data. All of these are political responses, and I suppose of course, Jeremy Corbyn's suggestion, which he was, I've seen speeches of Jeremy Corbyn, in fact it would be good to look at that, like speaking around the first or second Gulf War, saying this event will lead to more terrorism, more violence, more murder.
Thousands more deaths in Iraq will not make things right. It will set off a spiral of conflict, of hate, of misery, of desperation that will fuel the wars, the conflict, the terrorism, the depression and the misery of future generations.
Well, there's something important there in terms of, on the one hand, differentiating between trying to make sense of these deeply tragic events and without trying to give any sense of justification to them. And there's a marked difference between trying to explain without justifying, because we can say that all forms of violence should be condemned for whatever they are. And I think that that's an important separation. But you're right, one of a big central, the debates around this at the minute is, was this person acting alone or was he a member of a terrorist organisation? To me, that's less important. What's more important is the way in which this event is what we might call functions politically. How certain people would now almost appropriate the victims and take this event in order to put forward ready-made solutions, which they already kind of had on a shelf, and kind of saying, see, we told you so. And in a way, then the event itself serves a very clear political function, and the political function which I get equally enraged about, as I get enraged and angry and saddened by these events, are people who would use these kinds of events to push forward more division, more hatred, more suspicion. There's enough suspicion and division amongst people of the world today. Certainly our solutions are not going to be found in doing that further. That
appropriation is very real when families of victims have already talked about being bothered by journalists. That, like you said, there are off-the-shelf solutions immediately offered. We're recording this on Friday, and curb web giants that give terror voice is the Daily Mail front page. Then there are images of the murderer putting bins out in a robe. I often think it's peculiar, the sort of salacious subsequent coverage, because I don't know what purpose it serves functionally. One thing that I get from this image is, here's a person wearing a particular type of clothing performing a domestic function. Also, it starts to suggest that people that dress unusual while putting their bins out. I remember years ago, there was a story in the Daily Mail that said refugees are eating Her Majesty's swans, and then the picture next to it said refugees like these ones pictured are eating Her Majesty's swans. It wasn't specifically those refugees; it was just a group of sort of, I think in this case, Eastern European looking males. So there's what I have noticed is the continuing correlation between Islam more broadly and Islam extremism and Islam violence, but these events being concertinaed. I sense a kind of bubbling narrative for a mendacious level of social control.
Yeah, what we need to be mindful, the first thing that we need to do actually is listen to what the voices people are saying from Manchester. We're seeing this very clearly coming out, stories of compassion, stories of community, stories that this will actually not defeat us. And you know, it's not for me to speak on behalf of the victims, but what I do think we can do publicly is try to dignify the memory of these devastating loss of lives. Surely, to me, the best way to do that would be to try to attest the cycle of violence, to have a much more broader conversation that doesn't simply lead to the demonisation of an entire people, an entire community, an entire religion. We have to hold the person who is engaged in the violence as responsible. There's a responsibility, and we have to condemn the person who's engaged, or if there's a wider network of people, condemn them with the full force of our condemnation. But surely the more fundamental question is, how do we move beyond this? How do we stop these events happening in the future? And in that sense, put violence itself on trial. What does it mean to, as Gandhi says, to wage war upon war? In a way in which we have a much broader, open conversation that's going to be very painful, very difficult for us as a society. But that's the only way we can move forward from these types of events.
You're right in a way, Brad. The only supremacy that we can claim is one of a commitment to non-violence, rather than this type of violence we condemn, that type of violence is necessary. Violence is abominable. Murder always causes so much pain, so much sadness, and it's a cycle that has to be broken. I'm very interested in what you say, Brad, about not trying to piece together narratives from the past, but looking towards the future in a different way. Even sometimes people seem to feel that is you can't do that. You can't look at the future. People almost want to suspend, as in a moment of pain, and in fact to mobilise violence.
Yeah, and violence against children is an attack on the future. Let's not forget that children are our future, and if we hold children precious in this society, which every society should, we owe it to our children about making sure that their future is not catastrophically fated, that we can steer their future in a different direction, and encourage, create the type of society we want our children to grow up in, with security, with freedom, and with love.
That's very, very beautiful. So be supportive and loving wherever possible to people directly affected. Be supporting and loving to one another, and try to look for actual solutions rather than repetition and perpetuation of the cycles that seems to keep creating this.
Absolutely. We're in that moment where, we can steer history in a different direction if we choose to. Non-violence is not simply abjection. It's not doing nothing. It's a conscious political choice. And that's about time we actually give it a serious attempt.
Thanks. Some true news. Thanks very much for watching.